And welcome to our briefing on what's next on trade. I'm Lee Feinstein, Senior Managing Director and President of McClarty Associates, part of Ankara's Global Strategic Advisory, led by Fernando Bajé. McClarty is in its 26th year. We've pioneered the global strategic advisory space. We're a global firm headquartered in Washington with people and expertise wherever our clients operate. We're global in footprint, global in mindset, and we look at issues across geographies and sectors, and we'll apply that approach today with a focus on the trajectory of U.S. trade policy a month after the Supreme Court's decision rejecting the president's authority to impose tariffs under IEEPA. And we do so, of course, in light of momentous global events, including the impact of the Iran war, which the executive director of the International Energy Agency yesterday described as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. We'll look at the geopolitics, but also the specifics, and in the administration's efforts to reestablish its tariff authority, including new and expanded authorities under Section 232 national security investigations and a fresh wave of unfair trade practice investigations under Section 301. And all of this signals, of course, that tariffs remain very much on the table, just through different mechanisms. Discussing these issues today, we have with us Director Mick Mulvaney, a senior advisor at McClarty and former White House Chief of Staff, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and four-time member of the U.S. Congress. Kate Kalukowicz, former career U.S. trade negotiator and member of the National Economic Council at the White House and head of our trade practice, and Dr. Fran Burwell, managing director in McClarty's Europe practice and a foremost expert on transatlantic relations and the European Union. We'll be taking questions throughout the session, so please submit your questions using the Q&A capability in the chat. Well, let's start with the news and Iran. Kate, how is the war in Iran affecting U.S. trade, supply chain, and sourcing decisions? What are you and what should the people on this call watch for most closely?
Thank you, Lee. The biggest impact for me, of course, is that it's taken trade policy out of the headlines. But there is absolutely no doubt that the situation in the Middle East is dramatic for global supply chains. When we look around the world and these sorts of big picture items that impact the way goods flow, we're always going to have ripple effects. I think probably for me, besides the obvious, the Strait of Hormuz is a major shipping channel. And so the cascading impacts on the movement of goods around the world is obviously quite dramatic. It will continue. But when it comes to trade policy, when it comes to President Trump's agenda to remake U.S. trade policy, to change the way in which the United States opens its borders to goods entering, and the wide array of policy objectives that he has undertaken since becoming president, I think the most dramatic impact is going to be on the cost of goods and the affordability debate here in Washington, and whether tariffs cause increase in prices. I think we all know that they do. But I think this is going to be the most dramatic impact in the near term on trade, is that if the cost of goods, mostly related to the increasing cost in energy products, is going to perhaps blunt his interest, or the advisors around him saying maybe this is not the time to increase tariffs. We need to try to stabilize prices at the pump, prices at the cash register. So I think it could have this sort of passive impact on the overall trade policy.
That's interesting. Mick, how does it look from your perspective? And I guess, picking up on Kate's point about maybe a passive impact, what is the impact on the president's bandwidth and his ability to stay focused on what has been, such a big pillar of his administration so far, tariff authority as a key pillar of his broader foreign and economic policy?
Yeah, Lee, thanks. I was just here making some notes while Kate was talking. The last thing she said caught my attention, which is I think there is going to be a little bit of a change on specific trade policy. I'll get to the war in a second, but let's not lose sight of the fact that Peter Navarro was clearly a major force in formulating policy in the first, what, 15 months now, 18 months of the administration. He's not as ascendant now. He delivered Liberation Day, which Trump then moved away from, and he was the one who guaranteed the president that the IEEPA tariffs would be upheld by the Supreme Court. So that to me tells me that Scott Bessent will be more influential. No one person influences Trump. That's axiomatic. But Bessent's more nuanced approach to trade will be apparent. I think it wouldn't surprise me if, when the book is written about how the war has been prosecuted so far, that Bessent was probably influential in the decision to take the 5-day extension to the 48-hour red line that we saw just this week. That Bessent explained the economic impacts of that. And if he's doing that for military operations, he's certainly going to be doing that for trade. I don't think, all that being said, that you're going to see Trump change very much. And the same process will be followed. He's still in charge. It's going to be very, very difficult to look to members of the cabinet for any guidance on where trade policy is going, because they are looking for guidance from Trump himself. So the man is on TV every single day. Sooner or later, somebody will ask him about trade, and he'll be right back at the forefront of his mind. If there's one thing that I'm looking for, Lee, as we get into the war, I don't know if we're towards the end of the war yet, and we can talk later about how long the war might go on and so forth. It's this. Don't lose sight of the fact that Trump still thinks of tariffs as leverage. He always will. And if he's upset with some of our allies for not providing military assistance during this, you should expect him to strike back with the threat of additional tariffs, regardless of the previous agreements that have been reached. I think last time we did this, a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago, I lose time. One of the things I impressed upon people to consider was that the negotiation is never finished. Okay, if he could strike the greatest, what he describes as the greatest trade deal with France, say, or the EU tomorrow. But if then the day after tomorrow, the EU does something he doesn't like militarily, tariffs will come back to the table. The negotiation never finishes. And so we'll keep an eye on, as we move through the war, as to where tariffs pop up as a way to get leverage over maybe recalcitrant allies.
And actually, I'll just jump in, because I think, as I was listening, this situation really, I think, underscores the president's vision on resiliency, right? I wouldn't be surprised if this weren't an example at some point to demonstrate again why we should be relying on ourselves. We should be focusing on reinstituting certain sectors and products in the United States and reduce sort of the impact of these sorts of, can we call them acts of God? I don't know, but
Kate, I can interrupt you for a second and do something we're not supposed to do on these chats, which is to ask you a question I don't know the answer to already. I got asked, I don't know, yesterday, I can't remember where it was, about export controls, export limitations on domestic energy production.
Yep.
I used to put that at a very near zero sort of possibility. I have to take it up to 15 to 20% at this point. Where are you on that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that you said the president will continue to use tariffs as leverage, but I think the president sees controlling LNG now as his most important sense of leverage. We have seen, I think yesterday, the US ambassador to the European Union start to say, well, if you're not going to pass the trade deal, then we're going to consider how we give you preferential treatment to energy exports. And so this is a moment where I think all bets are on the table. These are private markets, of course, but to your point, export controls could certainly be used in this situation. They would be on the table probably through IEEPA. Remember, the president has focused very much on the things he can do through IEEPA, maybe not tariffs, but certain types of licensing or quotas. We may see IEEPA yet breathe another day here.
Well, that's a perfect segue to Fran. So Fran, how did the Ambassador Puzder threat land in Europe, and how do you see the war affecting Europe's approach to the United States on these issues?
So the Iran war is only the latest in a series of Trump initiatives that I think have demonstrated to the Europeans that this administration is on a different page than they are in terms of its strategies and objectives. And it's not always clear. So we have not only the threats to invade Greenland, we have Venezuela, which, although they didn't like Maduro, the idea of sending special forces in to take out a foreign leader is a little bit dicey. Similarly, they don't like the Iranian regime. But if you ask most European leaders, they will consider that this war is unjustified and illegal. And the German president actually came right out and said that today. And I think Pablo Sanchez in Spain, who has gotten the president's ire for being quite forward in his views on this. Other European leaders have been more sanguine or been more reticent to come right out in opposition, in large part because, remember, the priority for Europe is Ukraine. This is an existential war on their continent. It is not far away from when you're sitting in Warsaw or certainly in the Baltics. And they want to keep, as much as they can, the Trump administration on side with them in Ukraine. Now, the problem is for Europe that the Strait of Hormuz is a vital waterway for them. And it's not just for LNG. They get about 8 to 10% of their LNG imports from Qatar. It's also about other things such as fertilizers. And this is the planting and seeding season in Europe. And we've had enough trouble with European farmers. So I think the European leaders want to keep them happy right now. So I think, if Europeans want to respond to Ambassador Puster's comment, first off, I think they would say, we're not getting preferential access. We buy it on the market. And we've actually seen a couple of ships that were headed to Europe suddenly switch to Asia because they get higher prices in Asia. But I also think that they would say that Europe has been buying record levels of US LNG. The second half of 2025, after the Thornberry deal, was the biggest ever half year in terms of European purchases of US LNG.
Fran, do you expect to see Europe participating in some kind of effort to keep the Strait of Hormuz open?
Well, they've come out and said there was a statement last week, organized by the British. But now a whole bunch of different European countries, and I think also including maybe Japan as well, they have come out and said that they would participate in appropriate efforts. That's the phrase, appropriate efforts to ensure safe passage through the strait. So I think, yes, they'd be open to that if they could do it without hostile fire on their ships. They have minesweepers, which will be needed. So I think that door is open. Europe, when I was in Berlin maybe 3 weeks ago, the view was that for another month or so, they could cope with the closure of the strait in terms of fertilizer, energy imports, and things like that. But we're now nearing that time. So then it becomes a very serious economic issue for Europe.
We'll come back to this, but I also know folks on the call are going to be interested in all of the different numeric sections that will apply to tariffs since the Supreme Court decision. So let's go from the macro, if I can, to the micro. Kate, we're some considerable time away from the decision of the Supreme Court to reject the president's authority to impose tariffs under IEEPA. Where is the administration now, and where is it headed? And can you sort through for everyone the different authorities? And I think most importantly, which ones you think the folks on this call should be focusing on most, and where the greatest opportunities are for them to move things in a direction that they see in their interests?
Great. Now, I think it's probably worth revisiting what the president is trying to achieve through tariffs. I mean, he uses tariffs for lots and lots of things. Of course, there is his continued interest in raising revenue. I would hazard a guess to say he's going to continue to try to do that through a variety of tools. There's probably not a lot that we can do, absent litigation to stop that particular interest of the president. He's interested in addressing, as I said, resiliency. He's trying to reduce reliance on non-allied trading partners, but I would probably hazard to say he'd like to reduce reliance on anyone. He'd like for us to be self-sustaining in the United States. He's got a bucket of tariffs to do that. Those are these Section 232 tariffs, which, we can talk about. Then he'd like to address what he sees as unfair trade practices in other markets. And we have seen the administration, even with IEEPA in the backdrop, these Liberation Day tariffs, seek and negotiate agreements on reciprocal trade, such as the one we mentioned with Europe, but there were about 19 or 20 of these agreements. And, we should give credit where it is due. The administration in many of these agreements did secure commitments from trading partners to address longstanding concerns that U.S. companies have raised. We saw this in agreements with a lot of countries in the Western Hemisphere, with Korea, with Japan, with others, Taiwan. Now, the fate of these agreements is a bit in limbo, given the Supreme Court's decision to take away the president's authority on IEEPA. By and large, we've seen most trading partners say they intend to stay committed to those deals, and that's something we're going to have to watch. But at this point, the loss of IEEPA, I think the sole focus of the administration at this moment is to reestablish the legal basis for the imposition of new tariffs above what we call our most favored nation rate. So the U.S. tariff rate before Donald Trump came into his second term, generally speaking, hovered around 2.5%. Those are commitments we made to the World Trade Organization. These new investigations are seeking to create a legal basis to change those tariffs consistent with law. The authority, I think, that is most relevant at the moment is Section 301. 301 is an authority given to the executive branch by the Congress, and we should all remember that Congress has the constitutional authority and power to change our tariff schedule, but has given that authority to the executive branch in a number of ways, in a number of three-numbered sections, frankly. 301, most importantly, and maybe as a 15-year veteran of the agency, most importantly gives some power back to the U.S. Trade Representative. And for that, I think we should all be more optimistic. Let's say that there will be a lot of engagement here. The U.S. Trade Representative, consistent with the statute under Section 301, has launched investigations into a couple of areas. The first one is into industrial overcapacity. I call this the deficit 301. This 301 really should be seen very much as trying to recreate statutory leverage to increase tariffs on the 19 countries that were included. The second 301, which was introduced the day after, is on forced labor. This was sort of perplexing for a lot of folks, I think, who see Republican administrations as not the ones carrying, the water on labor rights. But, the Trump administration, led really by Robert Lighthizer, the first U.S. trade rep, focused on unfair labor practices as unfair trading practices, a way to undercut prices if you're not paying your workers, for example. This 301 investigation, I would describe as something intended to change policies in other economies, not to impose tariffs, although if it comes to that, I'm sure they'll be happy to do it. What is most important in the 301 process is that we have, in this case, a fairly lengthy public comment process, 30 days, which is longer than anything we've seen in this administration, followed by a hearing, a report to Congress, and more engagement. So in many ways, the 301 process is a really important opportunity for companies and stakeholders and governments to consider engaging the administration on barriers they hope to address, number one. But number two, we see an emerging consensus among some in the political part of certain agencies that a more nuanced approach on tariffs could be appropriate here. We can talk about that in a little bit, but this idea that if we retaliate on the basis of these investigations, we can do so in a more calculated manner. That's to say, as opposed to a new 10% rate on every single good coming from a country, we can start to analyze whether we have access to those products Industrial machinery is something that I think is on the mind of many folks. Semiconductor equipment, goods we can't grow or produce in the United States. We have started to build out a case for a more targeted treatment. And so I think this will be an important process for stakeholders to consider engaging in.
Mick, how do you see it? Where do you see the locus of decision making at this point on tariffs and related issues?
Yeah, well, it's still all the way at the top. So the question that becomes, how do you move the needle? How do you affect the policy discussions? Going to the lower level folks, which is how Washington ordinarily works, at least how it starts, isn't as productive here because they don't know. As I tell people, if either Trump doesn't have a plan about something, or if he does have a plan, he's certainly not sharing it with the team. So he keeps a lot of this stuff to himself. So how do you move the needle? How do you impact Trump? And I think what people need to recognize is the traditional way of doing stuff in Washington just doesn't work. I had to laugh when I watched that. As an aside, that with the big oil meeting about Venezuela that was in the White House a couple weeks or months back, I know who those people hired. I know what those people charged, and I know they're all excited to have a meeting with the president of the Oval Office. This was, in the past, that's the greatest you can get, right? And it was a complete waste of time for them and money. Donald Trump didn't bring them in to ask them what they thought he should do. He brought them in to tell them what a great job he was doing for them and to enlist their services towards what he wanted to do. That's how this White House works. So how do you influence Trump? You have to develop this sort of universe of advocates. You have to have the people on the team who are sort of pushing in your direction. There have to be people up on the Hill that are pushing in your direction. People on Wall Street that are speaking to him about it. Have to be people in the media. Have to be folks in the 4 or 5 newspapers that he watches or reads every single day. The 3 or 4 television programs he watches constantly. Donald Trump doesn't listen to any one person on any topic. He listens to a lot of folks, and then he arrives at his own final decision. He doesn't take ideas from anybody. So if you want to affect him and sort of creating this, I'm going to date myself here, Lee. Back in the 1990s, you may remember the famous University of Nevada, Las Vegas basketball team, and they had the amoeba defense. It wasn't a man-to-man defense. It wasn't a 2-3 zone. It was just whatever it needed to be. Everybody was sort of playing a different role on every single different play. That's what you need with Donald Trump, is sort of the amoeba approach. How do you get different people coming at him from different angles and different perspectives, all aligned on what you want the message to be? That's how you get into the debate on policy with Trump.
And I would offer, Lee, just to add to that, Mick is exactly right, of course. And part of this too is you never know when the president is something will jog his memory or catch his attention. You don't know who's going to be sitting next to him in that moment. You don't know what he's going to read. So it's always important, as Mick says, to have your message sort of disseminated across every part of the universe of Donald Trump, because at any given moment, that the person you spoke to might be in the room and in a position.
We used to have meetings on the electromagnetic launching devices on the aircraft carriers. Okay. And he would bring in all these people to talk about that. And in the middle of that, he would ask them what they thought about trade.
Yep.
Okay? So the question is, how do you make sure that anybody who's in there for anything is aligned on your issues? Because he's liable to ask anybody anything at any time.
And that's why it's really important. To take a step back, think less about what does Donald Trump want to hear, but you start with, what does winning look like for me at the end of this? Where can I align my message? How can I think about this universe of people who can amplify my message or convey the story so that you don't miss an opportunity? Because this is an environment without process. This is an environment that is not a dotted line. It's all over. It's the amoeba. I like that. I've never thought of it that way, but that's very visual. So if you are prepared, to stay in line.
There's no way she's old enough to know that reference.
I know what an amoeba is, though,
Well, so at the State Department, what we used to say, which was the opposite of the decision-making process, but it's related, was if the 7th floor, which is where the Secretary of State sits, we would say, well, the 7th floor agrees with us, so we're half of the way there. But here, obviously the decision making is focused on one person. But to Kate's point, there are ways to influence the decision, moving up. Fran, so what does a win look like for the EU? We talked a little bit about the Turnberry deal and the threat. What do you think the European Union is going to do?
Well, let me just first say that the amoeba concept is a great one. But that for foreign businesses and foreign governments, it's incredibly hard to construct an amoeba in the White House. And so it's useful for foreign businesses, if they have American subsidiaries, to use those American voices. But I think that what Mick and Kate have outlined just shows how all-encompassing dealing with the Trump administration can be. So to return to Turnberry, I think everyone here knows that as part of the deal, the EU agreed to remove tariffs on U.S. industrial goods, as well as to provide some trade preferences for seafood and some non-sensitive ag goods. So we're not talking hormone beef or anything like that here. This required a legislative proposal. And it is now at the European Parliament, where it has run into two issues. First, delays in the vote. This started with some MEPs wanting to make a point about Greenland. But it also has been because of the uncertainties around U.S. trade policy. These tariffs from Turnberry were based on IEEPA. So what happens when IEEPA is no longer the rule of the day? Well, with the new 10% tariffs, it sounds like a win for Europe under Section 122. And in many cases it is, because it's 10% plus MFN. So a lot of them are going to be like 12.7 because the MFN was 2.7 or something. But there are some significant ones that are higher than 15%. Probably a wash, to be realistic. But it was the uncertainty that drove the delays until there were some meetings last week and the week before, and finally the Committee in Parliament for International Trade approved the deal. It will now go to the entire Parliament plenary session on the 26th of March. But there's another complication, the second one, which is that the Parliament has added some amendments. These include a sunset fee and keeping a sunset provision, and also keeping European tariffs on steel in place until our tariffs on steel come down. These are not acceptable to the U.S. administration, and Ambassador Puster has been tweeting about that as well, or posting about that as well. We will now go into what in EU jargon is called trilogues. These are negotiations between the member states, the Parliament, and the Commission. And I think the U.S. government is very much encouraging the member states and the Commission to defeat the Parliament's draft and their amendments and to return to the original text that the Commission put forward. Fingers crossed that will happen. There are always possibilities that it won't, just because of other uncertainties. Doing this trade deal was not popular to start with. That's the reality. And since then, there's been a lot of additional things about the United States that a lot of European politicians are not happy about. But there is also a view that what you really need, the win for the EU right now, is predictability. And I think that they are envisioning that the 301, the deficit 301, as Kate calls it, will end up around 15% for the EU. And if that's the case, that's all right, because they've pretty much priced in 15% at this point. So if it's 10 to 15%, okay. But if on the way to resolving those 301s, there are more of these issues, these surprise issues that come up, then we could be facing a lot of transatlantic turbulence. The other win for the EU is that they are working really hard to enlarge their market elsewhere. Since this started, we have seen the EU-India free trade deal, the Mercosur deal, which will be provisionally applied as of May 1st, and just last night, the Australia free trade deal. So they are looking elsewhere, diversifying their trade to the extent that they can.
You could call this the global Trump trade effect.
Yes, you could.
Yeah, it's paradoxical but interesting. Kate, you were the senior U.S. negotiator in Europe for some time and at an important time. How does it look from your perspective?
Well, I think it goes back to something Mick said earlier, which is that no deal is done. I mean, things are going to change over time. I mean, the Turnberry Agreement, which, I was on the record at a different event saying I think the EU did a great job in that agreement, despite, how it was received back at home. President von der Leyen really gave very little on some core issues that US companies have complained about for a very long time, and probably everyone is aware of in terms of the broader regulatory environment in Europe. The EU did very well in that agreement, and they, included in that was a very smart provision to say that the US would implement the agreement first. The US has implemented its side of the agreement, and I think it's fair that they've grown frustrated with the lack of progress on the EU side. I have been impressed somewhat by the restraint and careful way in which USTR Greer, Secretary Bessent talk about they're willing to wait. They want the European Union to pass the agreement, but the patience is running out a bit. And again, stepping back, I said companies should think about what winning looks like. And that's true of our trading partners as well. I recognize very much how issues like Greenland have made this politically difficult, how discussions around a vast array of regulatory issues like digital policy in Europe has made this difficult. This is a democracy, after all. They have voters to answer to. But Europe needs to sell to the United States. I think at the end of the day, winning for Europe remains to have continued access to the US market. And the content of this deal actually gives them preferential treatment to the US market. And so for that reason, I think they need to just get it done and move on. Now, as Fran says, there's turbulence coming. There is no doubt. I mean, the deficit 301 is one thing. I suspect, as Fran said, we will end up with a 15% rate, but they may well say we are justified in retaliating at a much higher level so that we continue to maintain leverage, and then limit it to 15 as part of the deal. We are likely as well to have more 301 investigations on things, as I said, like digital trade policy or pharmaceutical pricing or any range of issues that the president sees as unfair barriers to US companies. So again, the deal of Turnberry was the deal of Turnberry. There are going to be many more trade issues, I think, that we're going to have to sort out.
Just wanted for a program note, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And I have one, Mick, and we're going to talk, if we have time, on China and USMCA as well, and how that looks in the US and European perspectives. But Mick, I've got a political question for you, which is the midterms and the approach of the midterms and the forecast that this will be very challenging for the president and his party. So how do you see this affecting the trajectory of trade policy, all the emphasis on affordability? How does it look from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, I'm not a big fan of conventional wisdom, but every now and then it gets it right. Of course, the conventional wisdom is the Republicans are going to lose the House. And I think that would probably be the case regardless of where we are in geopolitics and inflation and so forth. That's just the natural rhythm, right? The party in power always lose seats. And if you lose any seats in the House this cycle, you lose control of the House. The Senate is more interesting. I think 5 months ago, I did not think the Senate would be at risk. I think right now it probably is. That is impacted by geopolitics and inflation and so forth. And everybody else, again, I'm not telling anybody who follows politics anything they don't understand. So what do we look at instead to try and figure out what does this mean? And what it's going to mean is a lot more chaos. I think because if the Democrats do take control, they're going to impeach the president. My guess is if they do it properly, they do it the way that Nancy Pelosi might have done it, it would be to impeach members of the cabinet first, Pam Bondi, Pete Hegseth, Howard Lutnick, in order to try and sow confusion and chaos in the administration. If you're a cabinet secretary, ask yourself, are you going to stick around for an impeachment? Or are you going to retire and get out of the way? Will they be able to replace those people? So there's going to be all of this, fascinating court scandals that the press loves so much, and the turnover in the White House and all those types of stories. And that does feed on itself, and it makes it more difficult to get stuff done. It just does. I'm surprised that People haven't figured out yet that impeachment is a tremendous filibuster. It's a great way for the opposing party to slow down any White House. And it will be used, I think, more and more going forward, long after Donald Trump is gone, for just that reason. So I think that the administration will be tied up doing other things. That being said, keep in mind, I think almost with the exception of the one big beautiful bill stuff, everything we've been talking about now in this trade policy meeting, the previous one, have been done without Congress. The Trump administration has been able to do this on their own with previously delegated authorities, been able to do this using the executive branch, and they will still have that. So yeah, I mean, basically, you can rest assured there'd be no one big beautiful bill version 2 if the Democrats are in charge of the House. But the things that you've seen coming out of USTR won't change that much. Things coming out of Commerce won't change that much. That the attitude isn't going to change. In fact, it may get more aggressive as Trump sort of strikes back at what you would have to expect as an impeachment proceeding. But the amount of time and energy they have to actually commit to it will go down. I can't tell you, Lee, the number of times when I was chief, I'd go in and talk to the White House counsel about some policy that had come up at a cabinet secretary meeting, and he'd go, Mick, I'm up to here with impeachment. I don't have time for that policy stuff right now. That is a real consideration. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes a little bit of money, but that's not as important in this setting. So yeah, I think you'll see a different sort of approach in the second term. And I'll close with this, which is why I think you see an administration in a hurry right now. We're talking about the war because it's and we should be, because it's the biggest story right now. But that doesn't mean that Lee Zeldin is slowing down at EPA. It certainly doesn't mean that Russ Vought over at OMB and OIRA is slowing down on his deregulatory agenda, for example. They are in a hurry because they know exactly that the risks that I just laid out.
Very good. We're in our last 10 minutes or so, and I wanted to address another question from the group, which was on our agenda in any case, which is USMCA. And how this review will go forward. USTR Greer just said it won't be a rubber stamp. Well, Kate, what will it be in your judgment?
Will be a constant negotiation. I mean, this is true. We can always do better. We can always improve. I mean, that is sort of the mantra here. I mean, the affordability issue is important to USMCA. I think it has been what has protected North America and kept Mexico and Canada in the catbird seat. I mean, since the very beginning of the Liberation Day tariffs, of course, Mexico and Canada have the most exceptions. They have the best access to our market, and that's not by accident. Of course, the impact on prices in our grocery stores at minimum, if we put tariffs on originating goods from Mexico, or frankly, the impact on overall costs when we think about Canadian energy exports, are things I think that have kept the president in the place he is when it comes to USMCA. He's gonna, I think, till the end of his administration, call into question the stability of this arrangement. So folks are very focused on some of the deadlines associated with the review. I don't know that I put a ton of stake in that. The review envisions a process in July of this year in which the three countries get together and decide the future of the agreement. And then, of course, there are a number of stepping stones after that. I, in general, feel extremely optimistic about the long-term viability of the North American relationship. It is clear that it has worked. That doesn't mean that there are not problems. And I think, again, we see both sides, the Republicans and Democrats, offering suggestions for how to improve the relationship to address issues that they care about. So I think it will be a very dynamic process. A lot of attention, of course, has been paid to this idea that the Trump administration would like to negotiate bilaterally as opposed to trilaterally. I also think that's normal. We have been in this trade agreement for a long time, and the problems that we have with Mexico are very different from the problems we have with Canada. It obviously is a better leveraging point as well to have it be a bilateral discussion as opposed to a trilateral. We will have to do some things trilaterally, and USTR has told me already that they will have to do some things trilaterally, notably some of the objectives related to rules of origin, which center on the presence of other companies, other countries in this arrangement, and ensuring that they're not benefiting from preferential treatment. It's mostly directed at China, of course, but it's certainly relevant. for non-USMCA countries. Beyond that, though, I mean, I think that this, by and large, when we think about Mexico, is very much a security discussion, and that is what underpins this relationship. I think it is what is critical to ensuring success here. And so long as the Trump administration, and specifically the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, are confident in Claudia Sheinbaum's ability to deliver results in the security arrangement, we are likely to see a positive environment for USMCA. And frankly, I think the Canadians, despite obviously some ups and downs in the relationship, have I think started to make the case that probably because of energy, probably because of the situation in Iran, which Prime Minister Carney was quick to support, have, I think, opened the door for some more constructive economic engagement.
What about the impact of the 301 investigations on USMCA?
I don't think that 301, if we want to think about what 301 enables, it is an enabler of negotiation. And so really it is simply to reconstruct leverage. We have what we need in USMCA. So the 301 by itself, I don't think opens up the door to a separate process. But of course, it was notable that Canada was not included in the 301. And I think, again, that's related to energy. Again, that's related to the situation in Iran. But it was notable because Canada is obviously a significant part of our deficits. So, again, I think it is to reconstruct the basis for Liberation Day. But USMCA will be the way in which we negotiate with these partners.
We have a little bit of time left. I just want to get a little bit of China in the picture, since the bilat, which was supposed to happen the end of this month, has been postponed due to the war. The preparations were very intermittent anyway, but that's just the normal style. So really for all of you, and briefly towards the end, how do you see the trajectory of trade relations between the U.S. and China in the context of the broader relationship? Of course, I'm interested, Fran, from your perspective as well, about whether you see a divergence between the U.S. approach to China and the EU approach. So why don't we start with you, Fran, and then we'll go to Mick and Kate last. So we'll start with Fran.
So I would say that in the case of Europe and the EU specifically, there has been a real toughening of attitude towards China over the last few years. You look at the tariffs on battery-powered EVs, the new Cybersecurity Act revision will make it tougher for member states to use cybersecurity firms that are not from trusted countries. And the new Industrial Accelerator Act, although just a proposal, at this point has in it some language about investments that challenges foreign ownership in certain cases, and also challenges the IP sharing. So requires IP sharing. So in fact, it's almost like a mirror of some of the things that China requires. But this is the Commission, and this is Brussels and the Brussels bubble. And I think that the member states have a bunch of very diverse views on China, depending upon their economic relationship with the Chinese. I will say that one thing that has happened is that Europe has come to a realization that China is not a growing market. It is a big, and in some cases, huge market for their products, but it's not going to grow like it did just because the Chinese are taking this on themselves and producing what they need. One danger point I see is that Europe moves forward at American urging to become tougher on China. And then if there is a deal between Presidents Xi and Trump, Europe is wary of being left out in the cold and being therefore stronger and having more restraints on its economy vis-a-vis China than a Trump-Xi deal might put in place.
Fran, I'm glad you ended on that point. Mick, I'm worried about that too, what's your view about this?
Yeah, real briefly, I'm not worried too much about that. I think I know what's going to happen at the meeting, which is that Trump is going to announce that he's got a great relationship with Xi, that they've reached a fantastic trade agreement, and that nothing's ever going to come of it, at least nothing significant. It'll be, I think someone described it as the art of the announcement. I just don't see them have been doing enough work to sort of get what you have to get to have a comprehensive trade deal. And more importantly, I think both countries are sort of satisfied with the status quo. If the relationship with the Russians was a Cold War, the relationship with the Chinese is a cold peace. There's sort of this status quo. There'll be little skirmishes on issues here and there. Maybe fentanyl washes up on the shores of California. There'll be, threats of tariffs for here and there over minor issues. But for the most part, I think both countries have got to a place where we're not killing them and they're not killing us. So I'm not too concerned about I think the chances of a world-changing agreement coming out of the next meetings is probably fairly low. Europeans have to worry about a lot of things. Getting left behind on that is not one of them.
It's interesting. Kate, last word to you. And what about the 301 investigations and their impact on China and how that is or is not affected by what's likely to happen when the two finally meet?
Well, I mean, the U.S. has a number of 301s on China. So there's no doubt that they're always thinking about how to have leverage if and when they need it. But I totally agree with Mick. I think at the moment we are stuck in a status quo with China. And I don't know that there is, again, much impetus on either side to change it. Now, what that means, I think, for our allies and for a long-term vision, right, which is that the president understands that China has a chokehold on us. I mean, whatever happens, if we increase 301 tariffs, they can strangle us again over rare earths and other access to critical inputs. Why this matters at this moment and maybe is relevant to Fran's point, not directly, but this is a moment for our allies. This is a moment where we have started to see more of an opening to engaging more directly than we saw at the very beginning. And I think that is because in some ways the president is trying to rearrange the deck chairs before he goes back in for battle with China. If that happens in time, great. If it doesn't, it will be left. We are negotiating critical minerals agreements. We are trying to invest in certain sectors. We are trying to change the status quo to reduce China's leverage over us. Now, we'll have to see if that's plausible. I mean, in many cases, we've lost access to these things because we haven't had an economy like China's. We faithfully executed market-based principles. And so it was difficult to create efficiencies and markets for things in the United States. They are throwing all kinds of ideas at this, including through XM and this Project Vault and ways to create market conditions to make this more valid in the U.S. I don't know if it will work or not, but I think the longer term goal is to ensure that China cannot strangle us when they want. So I think long term we'll have to see if that plays out. To Fran's point on Europe, I mean, again, sorry, I go back to the same mantra, but I suspect if you think about what is in your best interest as an economy, rather than thinking about what can I do to please Donald Trump, because that's always a folly that you don't want to engage in. What is in my best interest? I suspect for most of our allies, it's not aligning with China. It's staying connected to the US and access to our market. And so I think over time, these things will just find the right path.
Well, we're out of time. Really appreciate all of the insights here. We will follow up this meeting with an email link to the discussion and also some of our recent reports on the launches of 301 investigations on U.S.-China trade relations following the postponement of the meeting and some of our foundational reports that followed the decision to reject the president's authority under IEEPA to invoke tariffs. Thanks, Fran, Mick, Kate, for great discussion. Thanks to all for your questions. Let's keep the conversation open. Bye-bye.